Good afternoon. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, July 14th, 2021. Happy Bastille Day, I guess I should say. My name is, again, Drew Clark, and I'm very excited to welcome you to this event. You know, again, we think all of our events are exciting, but we know those of you who are attending now and watching this in the future will really gain something from this discussion about 12 gigahertz. I'm going to say a few words about that before we get started and before I introduce our three panelists. But before I do that, I do want to say some news from the Broadband Breakfast standpoint. As many of you know, we do this every Wednesday, 12 noon Eastern time. We will continue to do that, but we are going to be launching or relaunching our in-person Broadband Breakfast Club. It will be back 2 weeks from today on Wednesday, July 28th. We're going to meet in person at 11:30 in the morning at Clyde's of Gallery Place. That's where we've been before. Many of you will know that, recognize that, been there. And lunch will be available. So not Broadband Breakfast, that's what we used to do. We're going to do Broadband Lunch, but we'll keep our name Broadband Breakfast. The program will begin at 12 noon, and it will be live streamed like this. So we're going to try to combine the physical and the virtual event. And to attend in person, to enjoy the lunch, you should sign up and become a Broadband Breakfast Club member. So I have a couple of little URLs. I'm going to send these through the chat window so you all can be aware of these. These will be both for what I'm talking about now and for this event in particular. That's where you go to learn more about the Broadband Breakfast Club and to join. And we do appreciate those of you who have thus far joined the Broadband Breakfast Club. I also want to give a shout out and a thanks to our sponsors. We are very grateful for all of our sponsors, Utopia Fiber, Lit Communities, Positron Access, Samsung, Broadband Now, and we are very pleased to welcome the 5G for 12 Gigahertz Coalition as a sponsor and as a sponsor of this event. They are very much in favor of having a discussion about this topic, and we hope to help facilitate that. I do want to say that we at Broadband Breakfast don't take positions or sides on the issues and controversies we cover. We, of course, are all about better broadband, better lives, but we don't say that wireless is bad or good, fiber is bad or good, satellites are bad or good. We just want to help promote high capacity broadband and to be able to facilitate discussions and reporting about this subject. On that note, we had a great piece that was just posted yesterday, and it's linked to the event page that you've all registered from. This is just a little bit about the battle that we're going to be talking about, the issue surrounding 12 gigahertz. And the piece by reporter Ben Kahn does discuss how this particular slice of the radio frequency spectrum, 12 gigahertz, specifically 12.2 to 12.7, has come to be controversial. And we're going to hear from, obviously, guests on different sides of this topic. We basically want to make sure that all opinions are represented. We want to, because this is so much a very live concern, the FCC is considering at this moment these arguments. There have been studies made by many of our panelists for this discussion, and we certainly want to make sure that you, our audience, have a chance to ask questions as well. So that's what we're going to go to. After I conclude, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who will be, and let me go ahead and broaden our view here so that you can see everyone. Eric Graham is our first panelist. He's the Director of Government and Regulatory Engagement for North America for OneWeb, okay, satellite service provider. And I'm sure Eric will tell us more about OneWeb and what it's doing and how it fits into this space. Eric will be followed by V. Noah Campbell, who goes by V, as I understand. So welcome, V. He's the co-founder and CEO of RS Access, LLC. And batting cleanup will be Jeffrey Blum, who's the Executive Vice President for external and legislative affairs for Dish, okay, a key player in this issue. So we will look forward to hearing from each of them. They'll have between 5 and 7 minutes to lay out some of their perspectives. And I do note that we have invited more than these panelists. We invited SpaceX, we invited other individuals to participate, and they obviously weren't able to attend. That said, let's begin. I'm going to turn over to you, Eric, to tell us a little bit about what is 12 gigahertz and how did it become so controversial?
Thank you, Drew. Am I coming in okay?
We can hear you just fine.
Great. Well, I appreciate the invitation to be with you this morning and to be on this panel with a couple of folks that I know at varying levels and have known over the years. We find ourselves on different sides of this issue as I represent OneWeb and have been with OneWeb now. I started with OneWeb back in 2019. Prior to OneWeb, I was with a competitive wireless provider in the southeastern US and spent 13 years doing work for that company and actually within that company. And the perspective that I bring is not only satellite, but also significant experience in the wireless industry, even through the standard setting process. And this issue of 12 gigahertz, what's in 12 gigahertz, how people are using it, how it might be used, has so many starting points, but perhaps the best one is what's going on in 12 gigahertz right now. And when we talk about 12 gigahertz, obviously we're talking about the 12.2 to 12.7 portion of the KU band, which is a satellite band that has been used, has been allocated in the US for non-geostationary fixed satellite service providers, for DBS providers, your dishes of the world, direct TVs of the world, with the satellite dishes that we've known over the years, as well as MVDDS services. And of those, DBS and now NGSO FSS have proven technologies that are working on this band. So for an operator like OneWeb and other NGSO FSS operators, this portion of spectrum is one of 4 critical links to our network. There's a link from the user terminal on Earth to the satellite, from that satellite down to a gateway Earth station, the gateway Earth station back to the satellite, and then from the satellite back down to the user terminal. And these satellites, these LEO low Earth orbit satellites, operate a lot like cell towers in the sky, just a little more advanced. So that link, that 12 gigahertz link, is what satellite operators like OneWeb and at least one other rely on to communicate with that user terminal. If you take away one of these 4 links, the system doesn't work. And when a satellite goes up, it's built to operate on these specific links. Unfortunately, our satellites are 1,200 kilometers up in space and not reachable by tower climbers. So when the gear goes up on the satellite, the gear stays up on the satellite. Now today, OneWeb has 254 satellites in orbit after our 8th successful launch just about 2 weeks ago now. That is a little over 40% of the way to our full constellation, which we'll complete next year. Our services will begin in November of this year, beginning in Alaska and then coming south from Alaska throughout portions of the United States. We have global coverage, and that's another important point, because as satellite operators use this 12 gigahertz spectrum, anywhere you stand with a line of sight to the sky, you have broadband coverage. There's a satellite that covers wherever you stand on Earth, once they're built, if you have a line of sight to the sky. So for the first time ever, we're poised to provide broadband access, and not even just broadband, but communications connectivity to every inch of the Earth, which has been a policy goal of the United States, cover every inch of America, since at least the Communications Act way back in 1934. Here we are, poised to provide this service beginning later this year and solve this policy problem that has befuddled the country for almost a century. And now we face a rulemaking request to have some of this spectrum converted to terrestrial mobile use have that allocation added into the 12 gigahertz space, which would introduce a level of service that uses a higher level of power, that would have user devices that by definition are mobile and would create harmful interference and be completely unpredictable. We use a very low level of power in the NGSO FSS world. By the time the satellite signal reaches Earth from 1,200 kilometers away, that signal is very weak. And a terrestrial mobile device, your smartphone or other device, will wipe out that signal to the user terminal. And clearly then the terrestrial mobile service introduces harmful interference for incumbents like NGSO FSS, as well as DBS. Interestingly, we're at a point in this discussion where the reply comment round has concluded at the FCC. We've had a pretty substantial record built over the past 5 years, and everyone had agreed that it was impossible for terrestrial mobile to coexist with the incumbents, just until the past roughly 1 year or so, when proponents of the rule change were able to find a way to create a study that purports to support coexistence in the band. Number of parties, number of unrelated parties who are not incumbents and not seeking the rule change, have agreed with the incumbents who say that there cannot be coexistence here. Even parties who would be claimed to have an interest in terrestrial mobile spectrum, like AT&T, says the services cannot coexist. Google, Microsoft, Boeing, the list goes on and on. So hopefully we'll reach the end of this proceeding very soon, and be able to finalize the regulatory framework for those of us who are incumbents and not have to worry about encroachment by terrestrial mobile into this spectrum that we're putting to use and that we'll be using to solve this almost 100-year-old problem of how do we connect all Americans regardless of location, and today provide them with broadband service. A number of other areas we can go into. I'm sure we'll get into that in the discussion. I just want to say thanks again for having me on the panel, and I look forward to participating with my other panelists.
Thank you very much. Excellent way to lay out the issues from OneWeb's perspective, Eric. Let's go right into V. Love to hear more about RS access and the way that you all have approached this particular question.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. I really appreciate it. Thanks for hosting, and thanks for Eric and Jeff for showing up on the panel. I actually, by and large, agree with most of what Eric has said. I guess I'll just give a quick background on my company and what we've been up to and sort of our history in this proceeding. So I founded RS Access about 3 years ago with my partners at MSD Capital, family office for Michael Dell, the founder of Dell Technologies. And we founded this company only to do this, right? The only thing we do is 12 gigahertz spectrum. And the reason that we really like this spectrum is it's extremely unique. It's very, very unique. It's 500 megahertz of spectrum, which is a huge spectrum position. Like by comparison, the 280 megahertz in the C-band is 280 megahertz. So it's almost twice the amount of spectrum. And it's in a very unique portion of the band. It's between, so when I came into this, we thought, wow, everybody's talking about sub-6 on this side and 24 gigahertz on that side. And there's really nobody talking about what's in between. And there's a lot of spectrum in between. And this is the only terrestrially licensed frequency, and that's really important here. This is spectrum that was auctioned by the FCC in 2004 and 2005 for a one-way service over 500 megahertz of spectrum. So in the context of the 2021 technology landscape, that's absolutely insane, right? They would never license the frequency that way ever again. So these are antiquated rules. They really don't make sense from a technology standpoint. They don't make sense from a usage standpoint. So we acquired 80 licenses in this band from folks who bought them at auction. And we spent the first year of our life as a company building out 300 links across our 60 markets in 28 states. And during the course of that build, we found out a lot about how this frequency can be used. And it turns out that this frequency is really in a sweet spot. I'll get to some of the studies that show that. So don't take my word for it as a non-engineer, non-practicing attorney. We have many engineers who studied this in depth for the last several years and can speak to that. But we were very encouraged by the spectrum and the performance of the spectrum. And the reason we were encouraged is because this frequency, unlike 24 gigahertz, provides the potential for huge blocks that really have much greater coverage dynamics than 24 gigahertz or millimeter wave frequency. Well, you've got a lot of the capacity that you get at 24 gigahertz. You get coverage that's much more like sub 6 gigahertz. And we just filed last week a study by Roberson Associates that really talks about the performance of this frequency. So after we spent the first year of our life as a company building out this network that we operate, we spent the next year of our company, the life of our company, trying to convince people of the value of this asset and why it's so important for US 5G leadership and why it's so important for US consumers. And during the course of that, we spoke with a lot of folks. We engaged with a lot of analysis in terms of, we're looking at the NGSO market and how that's developing. We're looking at the DBS market and how that's developing. And then we're also sort of paying attention to so what's happening in this landscape, and people who are watching this all know this, what's happening in this landscape is that technology is advancing really, really rapidly. So in 2016, when the NVDDS 5G Coalition, which is a previous coalition in 2016, filed their petition for rulemaking here, between 2016 and 2021, there were just radical improvements in frequency sharing and how frequency can be used. So fast forward to January of 2021, we're paying attention to all these dynamics. We're making a big pitch to the commission we're just saying, hey, look, let's study this, right? This is a really unique asset. It's potentially really important for US consumers. Spectrum is finite. We can't find, it's very difficult to find it, which interestingly was reflected in the C-band auction, which was, went for $90+ billion, I think, reflecting the demand that carriers have for wireless frequency. And the FCC agreed with us. They said on a 5-0 vote, there were 5 commissioners at that time, so a unanimous agreement to effectively just say, and this is what they said, what is going on here? What should we do here? And if we can create a situation where we have a win for DBS, right? DBS can continue to operate. It's an important technology that DirecTV and Dish operate. Very good for rural usage, and there's urban users of DirecTV and Dish Network DBS services. And then we have this new service, right? This low Earth orbit satellite service that's coming up. They have an allocation here. It's a conditional allocation. That's really, really important. It's a conditional allocation in this band. It's not a total allocation. Conditioned specifically on the outcome of this NPRM, right? Not boilerplate, not just language that you just attach to every license, specifically to OneWeb and specifically to Starlink. Your access to this frequency is conditional. So, but let's see if we can get these guys, but nonetheless, let's see if we can get these guys to operate alongside a service that's a really robust wireless mobile service. And the reason the FCC was very interested in that is because the US mobile 5G, mobile ecosystem overall is enormous. There are 440 million users, 440 million users of mobile broadband in the United States. And they're all using more data all the time. So our company was very happy with that. We said, this is great. The FCC is asking these questions. We were very excited to engage in the process. And as a result of that, immediately we went out and we retained extremely qualified, the best people who do this in the world, the most qualified entities who do this in the world. Former chief engineer of the FCC Wireless Bureau, a firm called RKF Engineering, which is top to bottom, hyper respected engineer, RF engineers, satellite engineers, PhDs from wall to wall, phenomenal, and guys who have a huge, enormous track record of the FCC of creating highly credible studies. And we said, guys, let's figure this out. Let's go to work. And that's what they did. And there were low Earth orbit companies, some other companies that effectively accused my company of lying. They said that we had a secret study that we were talking about and why we should have filed it early. And we just kept our heads down and kept doing the work that we were doing. And then on a timely basis, we filed that study. And that study is eminently clear. And I would add, we are the only company that did any studies whatsoever to prove this. In my company, like I said, all we do is 12 gigahertz services. We're a company that operates with a small staff because we're trying to prove out the value of this frequency and what this frequency can do. That study can very conclusively determine, and it wasn't hard, I'll tell you too. I mean, it was complex, but it wasn't hard. And these things are normally iterative. We started at the highest power level. We made assumptions that are very realistic. And then we just ran computing power, a huge amount of computing power to model real world RF dynamics for this. And we showed that fewer than 1% of future, right? Because we have to remember, there is no commercial service in this band right now for NGSO, period. So future users, fewer than 1% of those would be impacted. So if you have a system where you have 1 million users, fewer than 10,000 the trade-off for us seemed pretty clear, right? We've got 440 million US mobile subs. We've got, oh, Drew's saying that my time is up. So look, we're very happy with our study. We provided another, we put a bunch of other data into the comment process recently. We had Dennis Roberson do a report. We can talk about more about it.
Yeah,
but look,
we'll
net. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to go over time.
No, we'll definitely get to that. That's a key question we want to talk about is the studies and who's done them and how they should be evaluated. But thank you, V, for really laying it out, right? Laying out, why you started this, right? And some of the things going on. So we'll certainly look forward to responses.
I didn't mean to go over time. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, not at all. Okay. We're all good. We're all good. So thank you, V. Let's turn to Jeff now to tell us a little bit about DISH, because you obviously have a couple of roles in your interest in this band. So please, you may proceed.
Thanks, Drew. We don't want to fight. We want to share. We've been in the 12 gigahertz band for 26 years. Our first satellite went up December of 1995. We have over 8 million subscribers. We are in a unique position. We are an incumbent saying we want new 5G uses for this band. And that is very, very rare. We would not want to do anything at all to jeopardize our 8 million subscribers. And we are confident that NGSOs, DBS, and terrestrial uses can coexist. One of our sister companies is an investor in OneWeb. We wish the NGSOs the best of luck. There is a need for rural broadband in the United States, and we hope they're successful. But I know the press likes to call this a big fight of the billionaires. We don't see it that way. We see it as a way to update 20-year-old rules that we are actually urged, because 20 years ago, before the iPhone, there wasn't the technology that would have allowed DBS operations to coexist with terrestrial operations. So us and DirecTV urged very restrictive terrestrial rules. So it's not only one way, the power level is 1/100th of a light bulb in order to protect DBS. And as 5G developed and new technologies like beamforming and antenna discrimination and massive MIMO, we asked our team, and we hired the best experts in this space to say, should these rules be updated? And we believe that the FCC and Congress and the administration should look for opportunities to put more spectrum to use for 5G. The importance of 5G to our country and leadership is essential. And our determination was we can coexist, we can share. And that sentiment is not only ours. We are part of a coalition that you mentioned, Drew, the 5G for 12 Gigahertz Coalition, that has 33 members from the public interest groups, from fiber guys, from small carriers, DISH, RxAssex, for the people the small companies throughout this country that own 12 gigahertz licenses, trade associations, CCIA, Encompass, Rural Wireless Association, all believe that coexistence is possible, that we have a unique opportunity to update these rules for flexible use, and while protecting DBS operations, while protecting NGSO operations. And just to be clear, there's really not much to fight about. The question is not, will the rules be updated? I think they will be updated. It's too much spectrum not to allow flexible use. And it's not only mobile use, it's use for fixed wireless, for backhaul. And as DISH continues our satellite operations, we are also, as many of you may know, building out the nation's first standalone Open RAN 5G network with covering 20% of the population next June and 70% in 2023. And we believe that this spectrum can help us compete. We want to incorporate it into our network, and it's uniquely situated to provide sort of the speed that 5G facilitates if you have sufficient spectrum. And to Eric's point, we do not want to interfere with NGSOs, and we think we could have coexistence. And just to be clear, the NGSOs, as V alluded to, were told when they got their authorization to use 12 gigahertz that they're assuming the risk that their operations and their investments in 12 gigahertz were subject to what the FCC decides to do on 12 gigahertz, because we petitioned 5 years ago. And the FCC has granted the NGSOs access to 15,000 megahertz of other spectrum for their operations. And a lot of that spectrum is free and clear, where there's no obligations to sort of coexist. And we welcome engagement with the NGSOs, with our friends at AT&T, to figure out the technical rules that will permit sharing, that would allow 5G use, that will potentially allow opportunistic use that the public interest groups are urging to allow NGSOs to be successful, and to protect Dish and DirecTV operations. And I think that engagement, now that the record is closed, will start in earnest, and we look forward to having those discussions. Thanks, Drew.
Well, you generously used less of your time, and so I'm going to give that portion to Eric so that he has a chance to reply to some of the things that you two have said, and then I've got about 4 or 5 areas I want to dig into. So Eric, go ahead, take about 3 minutes.
Okay, there are a number of ways that that you can categorize some of the issues here. There are regulatory issues, there are practical issues. Yeah, it's true from a regulatory standpoint. Let's attack that first. It's true that there have not been other studies put in other than what the MBDDS Alliance has put forward, and there's a reason for that. This would be a new allocation, and so incumbents don't carry a burden of showing which allocations can and cannot coexist with incumbents. That's on those requesting a rule change. Yes, it is true that there was sort of a build at your own risk component to this, buyer beware. The same is true for those who acquired licenses with an MBDDS allocation 20 years ago. You got those with the understanding that these were the rules. So yeah, everybody sort of has that. I think the analogy here that might be good is zoning in the context of city ordinances, right? When you build in an area that is zoned for a particular type of use, you're expecting those uses, but you're always on notice that the zoning could change. And here we have a situation where someone is requesting essentially a zoning change, and the incumbents are saying, no, thank you. We can't have your nightclub next to our fine dining restaurant because we're going to have the thump, thump, thump of bass all night long. And by the way, we already have a business running here. From a practical standpoint, notably missing, I think, from the coalition of people wanting this change are the very people that are claimed to want this spectrum. AT&T not only is absent from the list of proponents, they oppose this change. Verizon is absent. Now, CCA did support this change on behalf of their members, which is understandable. Dish is a member, and T-Mobile, to some extent, is looking for this, but there's an element of regulatory judo going on there, I think, where they want to take Dish's momentum on this issue and use it against them to get a new allocation and strip Dish of the rights to the licenses that they have right now. So there's a practical piece of this as well, that you don't see the demand. Where is CTIA? We know where AT&T is. Where is Verizon on this? There's a field of dreams aspect to it of if you allocate it, they will come. And I just don't think that's the case. And especially when you see T-Mobile and in fact, the NPRM that listed all the bands that have been allocated to terrestrial wireless since this petition was filed. And then T-Mobile identifying at least 4 other bands around the 12 gigahertz band that could be considered for a use of this type. The spectrum falls outside the frequency ranges of 3GPP. It would take a new frequency range to consider this, or you're talking about a non-standard solution. We can get into all that later on, but there are regulatory and practical holes in the arguments that are made in support of this reallocation.
And Drew, could I just comment to what Eric said?
Yeah, go ahead.
There's overwhelming support in the record, including by T-Mobile, who are the 5G experts, that 12 gigahertz is uniquely situated for 5G and holds tremendous potential. And the way 3GPP works, as many of you know, is when the FCC authorizes a band for terrestrial use, then 3GPP kicks in. 12 gigahertz actually, from an ITU perspective.
Why don't you take a minute to
Sure.
explain? We really like to make sure people understand, so we're
Sure.
not talking in acronyms. The 3GPP, could you just explain that, Jeff?
Of course. So 3GPP is the standard setting body that is basically industry-led from all over the world. And when administrations, countries, authorize spectrum to be used for terrestrial use, then industry players could submit contributions to get consensus on the specifications. So, for example, for 700 megahertz, when the FCC auctioned that off and had service rules, 3GPP came up with all the specifications so it could be used for 4G LTE at the time, and then manufacturers start making radios and equipment. So it's a critical process, but the way it works is you need flexible use, you need 5G authorization, and then you go to 3GPP in order to make that happen. And that's our expectation here, that if the FCC authorizes two-way 5G use, then Dish, others who own licenses would file contributions at 3GPP and start that process, which could take 18 to 24 months to get done. And I should also note, international harmonization is important because the United States, as we're leading and trying to lead in 5G, we want spectrum bands that the rest of the world could use. And 12 gigahertz, interestingly, is authorized by the ITU for terrestrial use. It doesn't require a change to the ITU. Actually, the United States had to take an exception to that. So
let's okay. I see the hands. I see the grimaces. Let's get them in. But I want to start us off by this question of mid-band and just the constraints or non-constraints of the 12 gigahertz band, because it's interesting. We've obviously been covering 5G quite closely at Broadband Breakfast. We had a series called the No Nonsense Guide to 5G, and we actually just posted a video interview in which we talked about what is good about 5G. One of the advances of 5G is that it really takes advantage of lots of different spectrums, right? Spectrum ranges, right? And devices are going from lower bands in the hundreds of megahertz to the way up the 40 gigahertz, right? So is 12 gigahertz mid-band in the sense that it is really very useful for 5G, like the way people talk about 3.5 and the C-band? Or is this kind of more constrained? And I definitely want V's perspective. I definitely want Eric's perspective, as well as Jeff, if you've got any, on this particular slice of 500 megahertz, as you've talked about. And there's a question here about more. Okay, so you feel free to address that too on the chat window. But talk about how mid-band is 12 gigahertz. V and Eric.
So I hate to be like one of these presidential candidate debate people who answers the wrong question, the other question first, but if I could just point out just very briefly a different way of what Eric was saying, say the same thing that he said in a different way. There are 4 wireless providers. There are MSO providers. Dish is a wireless provider. They're a full-throated supporter. T-Mobile is a wireless provider. They're a full-throated supporter with some little weird things around it. AT&T is opposed, but they've said if there is an allocation, they should be an auction. And I think there's probably some things that AT&T would probably really like about this spectrum. Verizon is silent. And then you have NCTA, which weighed in, and NCTA said our members would like to buy this spectrum. So really another way of putting it is you've got 3 out of 4 of the wireless providers, or at least 2 out of 4, and you've got NCTA, which is another provider, obviously an MSO provider, and they're all supporting this. But set that aside for a second. Let's talk about the mid-band. So we don't, and then people have said this to us from the beginning. They said, hey, you guys are saying mid-band. This isn't really mid-band, doesn't perform like mid-band. Well, first of all, we didn't call it mid-band, right? It's not some sort of marketing thing that we're trying to do. The FCC included it in their mid-band NOI. They included this band in considering it to be mid-band, right? So the FCC has defined that. We haven't defined that. We did not define that. Okay, so but set aside the definition, right? Because when I first started doing this when I was, 23 years old, mid-band was like 900 megahertz, like 1 gigahertz. Yeah, definitions of say shit. Right. It keeps, like nobody would have said when I was a kid doing 2.5 deals that 2.5 is considered mid-band. People said that's way too high, way too high in 2003, 2004 when I started doing that. That's high band. Set that aside. We filed in our reply comments last week a voluminous study by Roberson Associates and Dennis Roberson, who is the chair of the TAC at the FCC and has decades of experience in this, and PhDs that work for him, that all they do is RF engineering, all they do is think about this all day long for decades and decades on end. I encourage the people who are reading or listening to this, and the people who are on the call today, to go and look at the Roberson report. It very clearly shows the unique elements of this frequency. It behaves much more like, this is just physics. This isn't me arguing it, right? This is just natural physics. There's no spin here. And if you trust Roberson Associates, they do some of the best work in the space. Take a look at the study. Not only is the way the spectrum perform very similar to what people consider to be midband right now, but it's 500 megahertz of spectrum. You could have 100 megahertz.
Let's hear Eric's reply on that point.
Yeah, no, I would actually agree with some of what Noah said. I mean, respectfully to Dish, I would not call Dish a fourth mobile operator at this point. Your next network will be your first, in fact, which
of course the Justice Department Antitrust Division counted to 4 when they included Dish in the deal. But be that as it may, it doesn't have it yet, right?
Correct. And I have no doubt, I know part of the team that's building it, and I have no doubt they're going to do a fine job with it. There'll be a mobile network operator next year at the earliest. So you actually only have one who lends some support to this idea, and they only do so in an effort to take the asset away from Dish, and that's T-Mobile. What is midband spectrum? I mean, there's a reason that this 12 gigahertz spectrum is sort of out there and has not really been discussed. And yes, physics is physics, that's true. But 3GPP considers spectrum up to 6 gigahertz, and then not again until 24 gigahertz. So what is midband spectrum? The rest of the world defines midband spectrum as spectrum that's going to be approaching that 6 gigahertz range, but 6 gigahertz at this point would be high band spectrum, followed by millimeter wave spectrum. It's indisputable. There is no frequency range for which 3GPP can consider this. They would have to create a new frequency range followed by new bands.
Right. Oh, okay. So maybe it doesn't fit right now, but in terms of do you deny or do you agree that there is a lot of possibility? Were there mechanisms to manage interference and other issues for the use of this 500 megahertz swath at 12.2 gigahertz for terrestrial uses like 5G wireless deployments?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that. The problem with hanging the 5G hat on this spectrum is this spectrum will only be used in areas that already have wireless coverage and will be used in narrower swaths than what's available at millimeter wave. So I hate that we keep going to 5G because I feel like 5G, much like China, is a crutch that we throw out there when we either want something or we don't want something. We want something, we say 5G, and we say China in the negative. You could reallocate every megahertz of spectrum or every hertz of spectrum in the US for 5G, and that doesn't make the US 5G competitive. The US becomes 5G competitive.
There's a whole showcase right now that the FCC is holding about how we could win the race to 5G, and a critical element of that is putting spectrum to use. As Eric knows, at C Spire, you need to find more spectrum. And if we have an opportunity to share spectrum, to your question, Drew, and make sure that NGSOs are protected. I see one of the questions is, how much spectrum are we talking about here? 12 gigahertz represents 3%, only 3% of the NGSO allocation. They got 15,000 megahertz. And then the expert analysis shows that 1% interference, and that's even without coordination. So we're talking a very, very, very small slice of what NGSOs are authorized to use. And to not take advantage of unleashing this spectrum for 5G as part of the overall picture. It's not low band, but this is certainly much, much better than millimeter wave. And as all of you know, the FCC over the past 4 years, we've had multiple millimeter wave auctions. And you need all. You need low, mid, and high. And this is part of the overall picture. How do we increase competition in wireless? And how do we increase US competitiveness? And one of the ways to do this is based upon the technical analysis. If we can demonstrate sharing It is good for terrestrial operators. It is good to protect DBS, and it's good for what NGSOs want to do. And that's what we should strive to do rather than just saying no.
We'll go to the sharing in just a moment, but let me just quickly ask Eric to I don't know, dispute or differ from this perspective, this question. Joan Egerbertson, a fellow competitor, asks about the percentage of the total spectrum that OneWeb or Starlink can use, and Jeff just said 3%. Do you agree with that, Eric? And to build on that, Michael Calabrese asks a question about this 500 megahertz is part of a much larger contiguous band for satellite downlink. How much of that 200 megahertz that he's referring to is needed? Is it a now or later question? Could you address both of those, Eric, and then let's let V reply and add on?
Yeah, let me start in reverse with Michael's question. So yeah, the 12 gigahertz band is part of a 2 gigahertz wide band of KU band spectrum from 10.7 gigahertz to 12.7. Unfortunately, the terrestrial uses, the existing terrestrial uses in 10.7 to 11.7, and even some of the use up to 12.2 makes that spectrum much more difficult, if not impossible, at present for NGSO FSS constellations. What we can use and what we know we can operate in with existing incumbents is this 500 megahertz swath of spectrum. And that is why we've engineered our system to work in that spectrum. Now, much as technology is advancing in other air interface technologies, satellite technology will advance, and hopefully one day we'll be able to use some of that allocation. But the problem is the incumbents that are in these other bands. 3%, no, not with respect to OneWeb and our allocations. And as I mentioned, when we let off here, this is one piece of a 4-link chain of communications for LEO networks, for our NGSO network and for others as well. Without this piece, we're not able to have the satellite to user terminal downlink. We cannot do the downlink portion of that series of links to make the communication network work.
V.
Yeah, I just like to point out, and this sort of like, I think that there's some sort of conflation, purposeful or not, with the NGSO, with certain NGSO companies, right? So like OneWeb, Starlink, to a lesser extent Kepler, they try to make it seem like, oh, it's 12 gigahertz in NGSO, 12 gigahertz in NGSO, 12 gigahertz in NGSO, it's all the same. But the fact of the matter is that these companies chose to use this frequency, right? The FCC said, you have a conditional authorization here, you make any investment at your own risk. There is one company, Amazon, a company with fairly deep pockets, who's making a huge multi-billion, tens of billions of dollar investment in a low Earth orbit satellite system called Kuiper. And their system they've got a whole standalone satellites are going to launch, and their whole system they're built. And I would just point out that system is going to be built and going to be operationalized without a single shred of spectrum in 12 gigahertz. None, zero. They chose, I have no inside knowledge of this, but Amazon, their engineer somewhere said, what spectrum, all these companies have this, right? They say, we want to do this low Earth satellite system. What spectrum should we choose? We have got 10.7 to 12.7. We got this conditional element of 12.2 to 12.7. Okay, that's what we're going to do. That's where we're going to take our chances with that. Amazon said, we're not doing that. So this idea that like, if you don't have 12.2 to 12.7,
you know where they're operating? You know where they're operating?
Yeah, they're in Ka, they're in millimeter wave, they're in all these different bands that are higher on the band plan. And that's just those are facts. That's okay. Not, I mean, like the reading rainbow facts said, don't take my word for it.
This is a great lead into a question about how we decide disputes, right? How our country, our government, our system of capitalism that is mediated by administrative agencies like the FCC decides, right? And before we went live, I was chatting with the panelists about the Coast Theorem, of course, and the Coast Theorem is a principle for the sharing, the way legal rules can work between competing claimants when there are property rights. Now, a lot of property talk, or there's been some property talk at different times in this conversation here. Oh, that's our spectrum, or we have this, or trying to kick us out. I would like each of the three of you to speak to how much of a quote property right should we consider existing incumbents in the 12 gigahertz band, or for that matter, any band, and what are the ways that these disputes about interference should best be resolved? Should it be going to the FCC, Mother May I, or are there other approaches? So I really truly would love everyone's thoughts on this question, because it has very practical application for what we're talking about here today?
Yeah, Drew, I think that's a great question. And I think the FCC is the right entity to look at all this. They have the authority under the Communications Act to update rules as technology changes, and they are the experts on managing interference. And that's why Dish and RS and our experts spent the time, the money, and the resources to look at coexistence and submitting our expert reports. And we welcome meeting with the FCC, we meeting with SpaceX and OneWeb and the others to sit down to fully understand how can we ensure coexistence, and that the FCC is really, really good at that in looking at the studies, pushing back, changing assumptions, and then coming up with a set of rules that manages that interference. That's what they do, and there's many other bands where they've done it successfully that are much, much more complicated, where you have government interests. Here we have no government interest at all. You have the existing licensees, whether satellite, terrestrial, or NGSO. So the community of stakeholders is relatively small, but the opportunity for the public is very significant. And I see some questions from Brett. It's not only about RS or Dish or the other license holders. We, as part of the coalition, welcome looking at opportunistic uses that could benefit WISP, that could benefit other small carriers, communities that want to potentially use the spectrum, as long as incumbents are protected. We want that engagement because right now the spectrum is not being put to its best use. And the FCC is really good at looking at the details and calling in the experts and understanding, and then coming up with a proposal that strikes the right balance. And we know at the end of the day, there's going to be compromises, and we want to have those discussions. And our coalition wants to have those discussions, so we could figure out, whether it's geographic separation, what power levels, placement, coordination, beamforming, intended discrimination. There's so many creative ways that the FCC is empowered to work with the stakeholders and the public interest community to figure out how do we get a win-win-win.
I think we should go to Eric next.
Well, do you want to say something, Eric? Do you believe that there are there kind of rights by virtue of being there or by virtue of the auction? Could you speak to this? What deference is owed?
Yeah, absolutely. It's important to note that users of this spectrum are licensees, and we have a right to use the spectrum, but we do not own the spectrum. And the spectrum is held in trust by the FCC and needs to be used for the public interest. So what is the public interest here? Is the public interest in once and for all having a communications network that can connect everyone, having multiple of these networks, in the 12 gigahertz band, or is it in spectrum speculation? And quite honestly, and maybe there's an extent of spectrum speculation anywhere, right? So yes, the petition for rulemaking here was filed a couple of weeks before OneWeb kicked off the processing round, and there's certainly a note on the authorization that notes this proceeding as a possibility. But it was also a possibility, and I think V would have to admit this with his investment in these licenses. He invested in these with the possibility that he would not get the rule change he's seeking. And Dish is sitting on some of these same MVDDS licenses, and yeah, they're authorized for a certain purpose. And when they acquired those licenses, there was a chance way back in the Bush administration that the technology would not develop. Well, now we are in a position where technology has allowed a service to come to fruition. It's NGSO FSS that is putting this spectrum to its highest and best use. What is a higher or better use than once and for all providing full broadband connectivity throughout every square inch of the US? Is it a higher and better use that we use this spectrum in areas that already have coverage? To the extent that coexistence is possible, and I'm not sure how they'll dispute this, but to the extent coexistence is possible with terrestrial wireless, it's possible to the extent NGSO-FS doesn't operate where terrestrial wireless wants to operate. Because when the two are together, there's no avoiding that harmful interference is going to wipe out the NGSO FSS signal. And then I'll just speak to Amazon. Yeah, Amazon's system is going to be different. It's not going to operate on the KU band, but that just is a testament to how different the systems are at NGSO FSS. It's a little bit like football, and football. You've got American football, you have football throughout the rest of the world, you have Canadian football. They've all got a ball, they've all got roughly the same number of players, but they are very, very different when you get down to the details. And yes, so Amazon will be on other spectrum. OneWeb and Starlink are starting out here and using the KU band spectrum.
I want to hear V's perspective on this, but I do want to tee up the question, V, about the power levels, okay? And so, you know, what I'm hearing Eric argue is that, well, yes, I mean, we do have, you know, incumbent, that, but it's to use these very low power, and terrestrial is talking about high power, which would you know, swamp and create harmful interference. Could you address that point and others that you'd like to, V?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to address, and I mean, I know we're coming up at the end of this call, but like I'd like to point out, I think it's pretty. There's some disingenuous statements being made here. I mean, to say that, oh, there's speculation going on here. I mean, I can't think. Look, there are commercial interests here. This has been going on for hundreds of 100+ years in wireless. There are competing rights. Their entities are competing. We have a system in this country which is a capitalist system, and people are competing for assets. So to call our company or Dish or these other speculative companies, I mean. OneWeb is not. Look, there's another satellite guy. He said, like last week or the week before, he was talking to some audience, and he pointed something out. He said, every low Earth orbit satellite company that's ever operated in history has gone bankrupt. Right? Our goal is not to go bankrupt. I mean, it's pretty speculative to be investing in low Earth orbit satellite systems as well, for a variety of reasons. So I think that really is sort of a red herring in this. But in terms of your COSIAN question and COSIAN dynamics, I want to point this out. And then there's some other talk about the FCC having to follow internet or wait for the international bodies to make standards here and just make decisions here. That's not the job of the FCC. The job of the FCC is to make decisions for the welfare of American consumers, for the welfare of American leadership, and the welfare of American telecommunications. And the FCC is very, very good at what they do. They lead the world in this. They have an opportunity to lead the world in 12.2 to 12.7. It's a situation where we have an opportunity, right? We have an opportunity to leapfrog the other countries globally. So to say that we should be waiting for the IT or waiting for international decision-making on this, I think is totally disingenuous as well. Really quickly, your question about the power limitations. And this is another red herring I think is going around. I encourage everybody, look at the RKF study. Look at the expertise of the people that are talking here. This is not an either or. This is not a trade-off. There is no trade-off here. And to say, okay, well, you've got a subscriber, a future NGSO subscriber who wants to site their service literally right next to a 5G base station. Look, I know, because I've sat in dozens and dozens of hours of engineering discussions about this very point. Where are these services going to be? And again, don't take my word for it. The Starlink guy has said this 100 times. Our service is not meant to compete in urban areas. We don't have the capacity to compete in urban areas. There are other NGSOs that say our business model isn't even to compete in urban areas because of capacity and because of market and because of cost and a lot of other reasons. So if I was to leave you with something, I would say that the trade-off, there's really no trade-off here. This is a win-win-win all around. I think the FCC will recognize that.
Jeff, do you want to address the power limits question?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I mean, the power limit. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah. Again, I was just saying this is what the FCC will need to do, working with the stakeholders. At what power can there be coexistence? And the services are going to be different. And, Eric is right in the sense that what they're trying to do is provide rural connectivity. And when where you are, they're not going to be in New York City, where 12 gigahertz could be great, for density, because it's so fast, and it could be used, for fixed wireless, where we know where the stations are, and you could have coexistence. There's a lot of creative ways. If the will is there, and we think the strength of our coalition shows that the will is there to take advantage of this opportunity to update 20-year-old rules. And it's also about competition. I see, some of the questions, Dish, we are entering the wireless business. We're an MVNO right now as part of the DOJ FCC remedy. We have very significant milestones that if we fail to meet, we'll essentially go out of business. But we are confident in what we're doing in terms of doing modern technology and O-RAN and 5G, and 12 gigahertz could help us compete. That's what the public interest groups have written about, that if we have access to more mid-band spectrum, especially in light of the C-band results, that's a positive thing. And again, it's not just about Dish. There's other license holders throughout this country who want to use it for 5G, and we welcome opportunistic use that the public interest groups have been urging.
So one of the great things about our discussions online is we obviously have at least 2 discussions. We got one in the chat, and we cannot reply to everything there. And obviously this discussion, we've tried to incorporate that. And again, encourage you to we have others who are not seeing this and who don't see the chat. And so, we want to make sure that you can address the key points. I want to give every one of you a chance, 90 seconds, to speak to whatever you'd like to, but do please address that. Where do you see this issue going next? What of the recent comments that were just filed, the comments and reply comments? So Eric, you'll go first, and then V, and then we'll conclude with Jeff, and then I'll just have a couple final thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with Jeff and with V that the FCC will decide this, and we have every confidence that they will decide it in the right way. They ask a threshold, the FCC asked a threshold question: can terrestrial mobile be introduced into the 12 gigahertz band without creating harmful interference for incumbents? And as you've heard, if you've listened closely, that answer is no, or it's yes with an asterisk. It's yes if you limit where NGSO FSS is deployed. I don't know what Starlink's plans are. I know they plan to serve a lot of rural areas, as do we, but it's incorrect to say that we don't plan to serve urban areas. We want to serve any customer that wants our service anywhere, because it will be available everywhere. And if that customer has a mix of urban, suburban, rural, national forest locations somehow, and wants a single provider, we can be that provider. So we intend to be everywhere, and that even doesn't even take into account aero and maritime. We think the FCC is going to get this correct ultimately, and even the Proponents own study says there will be interference. So that's the threshold question. The threshold question is there will be interference. Therefore, there cannot be a terrestrial mobile allocation in the 12 gigahertz band.
V, your thoughts, your closing thoughts.
I just wanted to quickly address, I saw a comment, and we're talking about, rural operators here and rural access to this, and WISPs and companies that provide services. Look at our coalition. Look who's in our coalition. There are rural provider, folks, WeLink, Zyber, companies that, and I talked to a company the other day, a known company in the fixed space, who said this spectrum is the best spectrum for fixed wireless, the best spectrum for fixed wireless. So to say we're not going to have any services, this is only going to serve the urban markets, that's simply not true. Or look at our RKF analysis, and it shows the exact same thing. We were very deliberate in the way that we understood the base stations to be distributed and the user terminals to be distributed. So there's absolutely a rural component here. And in terms of Eric's point about, we want to have subscribers who can put their services anywhere, that's fine. You have 100 subscribers. Just imagine this. Hey, hello OneWeb. This is in 2 or 3 years. Hello OneWeb. It's XYZ Corp. I want to order 100 dishes, 100 OneWeb dishes. Fewer than one of those dishes will experience any meaningful interference, and not even meaningful interference. Fewer than one, 99 will be totally fine. So if we can get it just, to me, it's just, Jeff said it earlier. This is actually very simple. And they want to make it seem like it's very complex, but it's not. You can have all 3 services. You can continue to expand 5G. Huge demand for it. You can have NGSO, let them have a chance to see what kind of business they can develop. Not going to harm their subscribers. This is easy. Comparatively to a lot of those situations, this is easy, and there's no reason not to do it.
Jeff, your closing thoughts.
Sure. This is a unique band. There's not a lot of spectrum out there that could be put to use so quickly to help U.S. leadership, to help competition, and I think going forward now, it's going to be meeting with the Wireless Bureau, meeting with the 8th floor, bringing in the experts, digging down on the assumptions and figuring out how coexistence is possible. And we think it is. And we were disappointed that the opponents of the rule change didn't hire any experts. It's not like there's only one coexistence expert. So SpaceX and OneWeb had months and months to hire experts to conduct their own simulations. They chose not to. And I think that's telling. It's not just about saying no, it's about trying to get to yes. As I said from the very beginning, we don't want to fight. We wish NGSOs the best of luck. What they're trying to do is important, but it's not mutually exclusive. We can do both. We could do what NGSOs want to do. We protect EBS, and we can use this band for fixed, mobile, and backhaul. And that's what I think the FCC is going to be looking at over the next 6 to 9 months, in detail. And I think discussions like this are valuable and important to bring the issue to light. So thank you, Drew.
Well, and I want to thank our panelists in just a moment, but I just have 3 quick points I want to make in conclusion. The first is that, technology advances, right? And we like the point was made earlier, what, UHF, I don't know if people remember that, ultra high frequency, right? I mean, that's like, down in what's now low frequency, right? So over the course of time, as we discover and make use of, and this is certainly happening with 5G technologies and space technologies and other technologies. So the technology in some senses may demand continuing reevaluation. Now that point may be a bit in tension with the next point I'm going to make, which is that, I think the standard is harmful interference, not interference, right? So I mean, again, I'm just, what I understand of the situation. So, the way to accommodate requests is through, again, property rights, Coast Theorem, I have to flag it again, right? So I would love to sort of see how to help facilitate these. Now, obviously, all of our panelists here are saying the FCC will make the right decision. I'm sure they will, right? But we all have to say that, right? But maybe there are other ways to accommodate private negotiations, and that's certainly something that the Coast Theorem and its implementation supports. The last thing is just purely, I want to remind everyone, we are here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. Please, join our events, and you can see them by coming through Zoom, but the other channels as well. And next week, I want to remind you, we are going to have the first of 3 events promoting the Broadband Communities Summit in Houston in September. And I will just sending in the chat window the place to go to see all of our upcoming events, as well as our upcoming conference that's taking place as part of the Broadband Community Summit. So that will be our next week, July 21st. As I said, July 28th, we will be live in person. We hope to see many of you there in person for the first time in some time. And again, you can see the continuing events on that page. I want to now thank Eric Graham. Thank you so much for being a part of this discussion, for giving us OneWeb's perspective. Noah Campbell for embracing the label there that we're going for a change, and to get that perspective. And Jeff Blum of Dish, for giving us your perspective as both a satellite user and a potential terrestrial user. On behalf of each of them, I'm Drew Clark, Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next Wednesday at 12 noon.